Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back in time, slowly. So, find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights a little, and let the day soften into the background. Because tonight's subject is both slightly absurd, slightly tragic, and very, very historical. We're talking about the eunuchs of ancient empires. Yes, you heard me right. The men who were, well, not quite men, not quite women, and yet somehow often closer to power than almost anyone else in history. It's an odd category of person to dedicate a full evening to, but history is odd. And eunuchs, as unfortunate as their situation was, played enormous roles across multiple empires, from ancient China to Byzantium, from the Ottoman court to Mughal India. They're the kind of figures who are always just out of sight in textbooks. But once you notice them, you realize they're everywhere, quietly lurking behind the thrones of emperors and sultans. And what happened to them is stranger still. Let's start in China. Because, of course, if you want to talk about eunuchs in history, you have to start there. China had an almost industrial-level relationship with eunuchs. Dynasties rose and fell, and there was always a small army of eunuchs right in the middle of things. Why eunuchs? Well, the theory was simple. If you remove the possibility of fathering children, then you also remove the possibility of creating dynasties, which made eunuchs convenient servants. They were allowed to hover close to emperors, to empresses, to concubines. They were trusted to guard harems because, well, the obvious issue had been preemptively solved. Naturally, this went wrong immediately, because even without children, eunuchs found ways to accumulate power. They couldn't inherit titles, but they could manipulate those who could. And with direct access to emperors, who often lived in such cloistered palaces that the outside world barely reached them, eunuchs became indispensable gatekeepers. No one got to the emperor without them, which meant that nothing really happened in government without them. Take the Ming Dynasty, for example. The eunuchs of the Ming court became so powerful that at one point they essentially ran the empire. There were entire government departments staffed entirely by eunuchs. And yes, if you're picturing a bureaucratic nightmare of bickering, paper shuffling, and endless corruption, you are absolutely correct. One eunuch, named Wei Zhongxian, became so dominant in the 1620s that officials actually bowed to him as though he were the emperor himself. He was nicknamed 9,000-year-old because 10,000-year-old was the title reserved for the actual emperor. It's hard to think of a title that's both more flattering and more ridiculous at the same time. Wei Zhongxian ordered temples built in his honor. He purged anyone who dared to criticize him, and naturally, he became immensely wealthy in the process. When he finally fell from power, because eventually they all do, he hanged himself, perhaps realizing that a eunuch's retirement plan was not exactly secure. But China wasn't the only place where eunuchs thrived. Let's drift west slowly to Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire had a long and complicated relationship with eunuchs. In fact, they were considered an entire third gender category in Byzantine law, which is progressive in a deeply unintentional sort of way. Byzantine eunuchs often rose higher than almost anyone else. One of the most famous, a man named Narses, was a eunuch general in the 6th century. Yes, a general. Apparently, being castrated did not prevent one from leading armies. Narses helped reconquer Italy for the Byzantine Empire, and he lived long enough to die rich and comfortable, which, for Byzantium, is basically winning the lottery. Eunuchs in Byzantium were also seen as perfect candidates for high office. Why? Because they could not start dynasties of their own, which meant an emperor could trust them with power, at least in theory. In practice, they were just as conniving as everyone else, perhaps even more so, because their only path to influence was manipulation. One particularly infamous Byzantine eunuch, Joseph Bringas, essentially ran the empire under Emperor Romanos II. When the emperor died young, because emperors always seemed to die young in Byzantium, Bringas tried to outmaneuver the empress widow, Theophano. It did not go well for him. Let's just say that Theophano knew how to play the game, and Bringas ended up quietly sidelined. Now, let's drift south to the Ottoman Empire, where eunuchs were not only powerful, but absolutely central to palace life. In the Ottoman court, there were two categories of eunuchs: the white eunuchs and the black eunuchs. The white eunuchs were often European boys, castrated and brought into service. The black eunuchs were usually from Africa, brought through the slave trade. The most powerful of all was the chief black eunuch, known as the Kızlar Ağa. This man held sway over the imperial harem. And since the harem was not just about concubines, but also about mothers, sisters, and daughters of the sultan, this position meant wielding immense influence. If you wanted to influence the sultan, you usually had to go through the chief black eunuch. He could make or break political careers with a whisper. It's worth noting that the chief black eunuch's position lasted for centuries. It was one of the most stable roles in Ottoman politics, despite being, on the surface, the least enviable. And then there's Mughal India. Eunuchs there were similarly entrenched in the courts. They guarded the women's quarters, yes, but also handled money, property, and even diplomacy. In some ways, they were the trusted fixers of the empire. If you needed something done quietly, a eunuch might be the one to arrange it. One Mughal emperor, Jahangir, even complained in his memoirs about eunuchs being too powerful, which is rather telling. When an emperor, sitting on a throne of unimaginable wealth, is annoyed about your influence, you've definitely carved out a niche for yourself. So, what happened to them? To the eunuchs of history, once their services were no longer needed? The answer is not very comforting. Most eunuchs were slaves. They did not retire to country estates. They did not pass down titles or estates to heirs. Often they died in service. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they retired with a modest pension. Occasionally, the most powerful died rich, but without families, their fortunes usually ended up confiscated. In many ways, eunuchs were indispensable and disposable at the same time. They could rise to astonishing power, whispering in the ear of emperors, directing armies, shaping dynasties, and yet they were always outsiders, half trusted, half despised, needed, but never fully embraced. It's a strange legacy. One part tragedy, one part irony, and one part, well, very human in its mixture of cruelty and pragmatism. And so, that's where we'll leave them for now. The eunuchs of ancient empires. Not quite rulers, not quite servants. Strange, liminal figures, forever hovering in the shadows of history. Let's take a slow breath and drift onward to our next royal fiasco. So, let's settle back in. If you're still awake, and honestly, if you're not, I'll take that as a compliment. We'll keep floating through the lives of history's most unfortunate, yet strangely powerful figures. Because the story of eunuchs doesn't just end with a shrug. It lingers. It winds its way through centuries, across continents, and into the odd corners of royal households where people tried very hard to keep the wrong people out and the right people under control. Naturally, they made it worse. We should pause here and address the actual process. Not in lurid detail, don't worry, but just enough to understand why eunuchs were, in a sense, both feared and pitied. Castration was not exactly an advanced medical procedure in antiquity. It was usually done by force on children or teenagers. Most did not survive. Those who did often suffered lifelong health issues. They were more prone to obesity. Their bones sometimes grew oddly, and without testosterone, they had higher voices, softer features, and, let's just say, an appearance that was noticeably different. In other words, they were marked forever. You couldn't really hide being a eunuch. Everyone knew. And yet, despite this, societies kept producing them. Why? Because rulers found them useful, and usefulness outweighed mercy. In China, for example, the palace eunuchs were so ubiquitous that ordinary people began to view them almost as a separate caste. Some families were so desperate for advancement that they voluntarily offered their sons to the knife. Imagine that, looking at your boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, and deciding, yes, he'll never give me grandchildren, but maybe one day he'll hand me a bag of gold from the palace. It's a grim calculation. And yet it happened. Some boys even volunteered themselves. They saw eunuchs living in luxury, draped in silk, eating food most people could never imagine, and thought, well, why not? And then they discovered, of course, that for every one eunuch who clawed his way to power, thousands spent their lives sweeping floors, serving tea, and trying not to be noticed. The Byzantines, meanwhile, had a strange fascination with eunuchs in religion. Because eunuchs could not marry, they were considered ideal candidates for monastic life. Less temptation, supposedly. Of course, monasteries were already full of ordinary men who weren't exactly radiating temptation, but the Byzantines were very fond of legal categories. So eunuchs became priests, bishops, and even patriarchs of Constantinople. One of the most famous eunuch churchmen was Ignatius, patriarch of Constantinople in the 9th century. He was actually the son of an emperor, forced into becoming a eunuch monk to prevent him from competing for the throne. And yet, he still rose to one of the highest positions in the church. Proof, perhaps, that cutting someone out of politics in Byzantium almost always backfired. The Ottomans added yet another twist. For them, eunuchs were guardians not just of harems, but of secrets. The chief black eunuch often knew things about the sultan's family that no vizier or general ever would: births, deaths, scandals. He was like a living archive of gossip, which in an imperial court is the most powerful archive of all. One chief eunuch in the 17th century, Hatshepsut Ah, essentially acted as prime minister during his tenure. He was beloved by some, feared by most, and quietly despised by nearly everyone else. But of course, no one could really remove him, because who would guard the harem? And more importantly, who would want to replace him? And then there are the personal lives of eunuchs, which, admittedly, are difficult to reconstruct. Most historians simply didn't bother recording them. Eunuchs were often treated as functionaries, not as individuals, but we can piece together fragments. Many formed deep bonds with the women they guarded, sometimes platonic, sometimes more complicated. After all, desire doesn't disappear just because anatomy does, and palace rumor mills were always happy to speculate. Some eunuchs became confidants, almost like surrogate brothers to empresses or concubines. Others were despised as spies, It really depended on personality and, of course, politics. And yet, despite their proximity to power, eunuchs often lived with profound loneliness. They could not marry, at least not in the usual sense. They could not have children. Their families were often far away, if they even survived at all. They lived in palaces, yes, but palaces that were cages as much as they were gilded halls. There's a haunting poem from late imperial China, written by a eunuch, lamenting his fate. He writes about watching the moon and realizing he has no one to share it with. He writes about his body, marked forever, and he writes about serving emperors, while knowing he himself would vanish from memory the moment he died. Soft, sad words from someone history rarely lets speak. So, what did happen to them? In the long view of history, they disappear. Not suddenly, but gradually. As empires declined, the demand for eunuchs dwindled. China finally banned the practice in the early 20th century. The last imperial eunuch, Sun Yaoting, lived until 1996. Yes, 1996. He had been castrated as a child to serve the Qing dynasty, only for the dynasty to collapse shortly after, which is the kind of cosmic irony that feels almost scripted. He lived through the fall of emperors, the warlords, the Japanese invasion, civil war, Mao, and into modern China. And when he died, he was a frail old man who carried the end of an entire institution in his body. The Ottoman system of eunuchs collapsed with the empire itself in the early 20th century. By then, the role had already become ceremonial, a relic of a world that was fading. And in Europe, of course, the practice had long since disappeared. Except, curiously, for one bizarre holdout, the castrati singers of Italy. Boys castrated before puberty to preserve their high voices for church choirs. Their music was considered divine. Their personal lives, predictably, were miserable. The last famous castrato, Alessandro Moreschi, died in 1922. You can even listen to recordings of him today. A haunting, otherworldly voice, the sound of an entire practice vanishing into silence. So, in the end, eunuchs were everywhere, and then nowhere. Once essential, now forgotten. Shadows in palaces that no longer exist. Guardians of harems that are empty. Whisperers in courts that have long since turned to dust. And perhaps that's the final irony. That men who once stood so close to power are now remembered, if at all, as curiosities, half men, half legends, full reminders of how strange human history can be. And with that, let's take another slow step into the past, because our next story isn't about eunuchs at all. It's about bloodlines, and what happens when royals become just a little too fond of keeping things in the family. But that is where we'll drift next. All right. If you're still awake, you've officially made it through the eunuchs. Congratulations. You now know more about palace servants than most people ever wanted. So let's drift sideways into another corner of history that is equal parts fascinating and slightly uncomfortable. Cannibalism. Yes. Tonight, we're floating gently into the world of people who ate other people. Don't worry, we're not going to get gory. This is bedtime history, not a horror film. But we are going to explore how entire societies once thought of cannibalism not as a taboo, but as Tuesday. Now, the thing about cannibalism is that it makes modern audiences recoil, understandably. But for much of history, the line between food and not food was more negotiable. If you were starving, if you were waging war, or if you were trying to terrify your enemies, eating the occasional person was not out of the question. And so, Across the world, many groups practiced some form of cannibalism, ritual, revenge, or simply survival. Most of them are forgotten now, but tonight we'll bring a few of them back into the faint candlelight. Let's begin in the Americas. The Aztecs are often remembered for their blood sacrifices, their towering temples, and their remarkable knack for engineering floating gardens. What they're less fondly remembered for is the part where sacrificial victims didn't always go to waste. After ceremonies, the bodies of the slain could be cooked and consumed in a highly ritualized manner. It wasn't everyday dinner. It wasn't like they had a cannibalism section in the marketplace, but it was part of the religious fabric. And when the Spanish conquistadors arrived and witnessed it, they were horrified. Of course, the Spanish were simultaneously burning people alive in the Inquisition, so perhaps horrified should be taken with a pinch of salt. Moving a little further south, we find the Tupinamba of Brazil. They were described by early European explorers in horrified and possibly exaggerated tones as enthusiastic cannibals. The Tupinamba didn't eat people out of hunger. They ate enemies captured in war. It was a ritual of humiliation, of absorbing power, of saying essentially, "You tried to fight us, and now you're lunch." French explorers in the 16th century even recorded banquets where prisoners were slowly killed and then consumed in pieces, which is horrifying, but it also became a source of fascination for Europeans who began to imagine Brazil as some exotic nightmare. The word cannibal itself entered European languages from these encounters. Over in the Pacific, the practice was even more widespread. Many Polynesian societies, including those in Fiji and New Zealand, engaged in cannibalism. Fiji, in fact, was once nicknamed the Cannibal Isles by European sailors, which is the kind of branding that really doesn't help your tourism industry. Chiefs sometimes ate enemies as displays of dominance. Missionaries reported witnessing feasts where the flesh of rivals was ceremonially roasted. In New Zealand, the Maori also practiced cannibalism in warfare. Again, it wasn't about hunger. It was about mana, spiritual power. Consuming an enemy's body was a way of consuming their strength, their prestige, their life force. Terrifying, yes, but also deeply symbolic. And then, drifting into Africa, we find scattered accounts of ritual cannibalism as well. Some Central African kingdoms were accused of it by outsiders, though it's always hard to tell how much was real and how much was colonial propaganda. European explorers were often eager to paint Africans as savages, and nothing drove the point home faster than tales of cannibalism. One of the most infamous cases is the Azande of Central Africa, who were said to practice occasional ritual cannibalism into the 19th century. Again, whether this was widespread or exaggerated is debatable. But the stories stuck. And then, finally, there's Europe. Because, surprise, cannibalism wasn't just something that others did. Europeans had their moments too. Famines drove desperate communities to eat human flesh more than once. During the Great Famine of 1315, there were whispered accounts of peasants resorting to cannibalism. And in sieges, like the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 during the Crusades, there were chroniclers who admitted, quietly, that starving soldiers had eaten the dead, not ceremonially, not ritually, just out of sheer hunger. Even stranger, for centuries, Europeans practiced medical cannibalism. Yes, doctors prescribed powdered human bone, ground-up mummy, or even fresh blood as remedies. It was believed to cure everything from headaches to epilepsy. Kings and queens themselves partook. So if you're imagining cannibalism as something exotic and far away, remember, Your average 17th century European noble might have sipped a glass of blood as medicine before lecturing others about savagery. So what happened to all of this? Why did cannibalism disappear from mainstream societies? The simple answer is changing moral codes. The rise of Christianity in Europe, Islam in the Middle East, and Buddhism in Asia all condemned the practice. Global trade made famines less severe, so people didn't have to turn to desperate measures as often. And of course, colonialism. European powers worked very hard to suppress indigenous practices they considered barbaric, which again is ironic given the powdered mummy problem. By the 19th century, cannibalism had mostly retreated into myth, rumor, and accusation. Explorers still swore they saw it. Missionaries still wrote reports of it. But whether it was happening as much as they claimed is questionable. And yet the idea of cannibal tribes has never left our imagination. They haunt adventure novels, lurk in old maps, and occasionally pop up in documentaries with ominous music. Because cannibalism is one of those taboos that fascinates even as it repels. The truth, though, is quieter. Most cannibal tribes of history were not monsters. They were people living in harsh conditions, following cultural codes that made sense to them. To them, eating human flesh was not about horror. It was about ritual, about survival, about meaning. We, from our beds centuries later, may shudder at the thought. But for them, it was life. And then, like all customs, it faded away. So tonight we've drifted through shadows, from eunuchs in gilded palaces to forgotten cannibal tribes, from whispers in royal courts to smoke rising from ritual feasts. And history, as always, shows us how strange, how unsettling, and how deeply human the past can be. Now, let's take another breath, and in the next part we'll slip back into the world of Europe's royal families, the ones who, despite having palaces, silk, and endless titles, still manage to sabotage themselves with a little too much family affection. But that we'll save for part 4. So, we've wandered through eunuchs in silk and cannibals with ritual feasts. Now let's change the atmosphere again. Let's dim the torchlight and walk down a spiral staircase, because our next story takes us into the medieval dungeon. Now, when most people picture a dungeon, they imagine iron cages, rats nibbling at toes, and a villain twirling his mustache while someone is chained to the wall. Hollywood has made sure of that. But the reality, as always, is both less glamorous and, in its own dreary way, much worse. So what did prisoners actually do in medieval dungeons all day? The short answer, not much. The long answer, a whole lot of being bored, being cold, and trying very hard not to die of something unpleasant. Let's begin with the dungeon itself. The word comes from the French donjon, which originally meant the main tower of a castle. That's right, the dungeon wasn't originally the creepy basement. It was the keep, the big, strong tower where the Lord lived. Which is rather ironic, because by the time we use the word today, it conjures up something more like the world's least comfortable basement apartment. Medieval prisons weren't really designed for long-term stays. They were holding places, a spot to stash someone until trial, ransom, or execution. No one expected you to live there for years, although, naturally, some people did. So what did daily life look like? Well, first, the cell. If you were lucky, it was a simple room. Stone walls, maybe a straw mat, a bucket in the corner. If you were unlucky, it was more of a pit, literally a hole in the ground with a grate on top. Fresh air, when you got it, smelled faintly of sewage. Prisoners spent hours, days, even weeks in darkness, sometimes chained to the wall, sometimes with enough freedom to shuffle around in circles. Their main companions were rats, and, depending on the season, fleas. So, what did they do? Mostly, they endured. There was no medieval equivalent of prison libraries, no rehabilitation programs, no friendly chess sets or deck of cards. A prisoner's daily activities were sitting, lying down, scratching, coughing, shivering, and occasionally crying. Some prayed. A lot. Because when the only people visiting you are jailers who smell worse than the rats, prayer starts to feel like the only hobby available. Others sang, told stories, or muttered to themselves. Some carved graffiti into the walls. If you visit certain castles today, you can still see prisoners' names and desperate little pictures scratched into the stone. It was the medieval version of I was here. Food, when it came, was not gourmet. Bread, gruel, maybe some meat if you were high-born. Sometimes family members had to bring food themselves. If no one cared about you, you might simply starve. Medieval justice was very efficient that way. And then there was the matter of light. Candles were a luxury, windows were rare. So for much of the day, prisoners sat in near darkness. Their sense of time faded. Hours bled into days. Days into weeks. For some, that was punishment enough, the crushing monotony. But not everyone was treated the same. Nobles naturally got nicer prisons. Instead of a dungeon pit, a lord might be kept under house arrest in a castle chamber, complete with servants, meals, and the occasional visitor. The medieval idea of fairness was very flexible. For example, when Richard the Lionheart was captured in 1192, he was held in relative comfort. His ransom was enormous, nearly bankrupting England. But during captivity, he wasn't exactly gnawing on rat tails. He dined. He wrote songs. He sulked. In other words, he was Richard the Lionheart. Meanwhile, ordinary prisoners languished in filth. Some never even made it to trial. They simply disappeared into the dark. And then, of course, there's the question of torture. Did medieval prisoners spend all day being stretched on racks and burned with irons? Not really. Torture was not an everyday hobby. It was expensive. It required tools. And someone had to be motivated enough to ask questions. Most prisoners weren't tortured. They were just forgotten, left to rot until someone remembered they existed, which in many ways was probably worse, because torture at least ended. Boredom, hunger, and cold lasted forever. So how did they pass the time? They improvised. Some tried to befriend their jailers. Others plotted escapes, usually unsuccessfully. A few, if literate, might scrawl letters or poetry. In the Tower of London, you can still see elaborate carvings left by prisoners who spent their days etching names, prayers, and crests into the walls. One prisoner carved an entire calendar, scratching a mark for every single day of captivity. A slow, desperate way of keeping track of time in a world where time had almost stopped. And then eventually, something happened. A trial, a ransom paid, a pardon, or more often, an execution, because dungeons weren't really about rehabilitation. They were about delay, about holding you until someone decided what to do. For many, that meant a slow death in darkness. For others, it meant being hauled up the stairs one last time, into the sunlight, and then to the scaffold. So, what did prisoners in medieval dungeons do all day? They waited. They suffered. They carved their names in stone. They prayed. They cursed. They dreamed. They wasted away. It was monotonous. It was bleak. And it was history at its most quietly cruel. And with that, we'll close the dungeon door behind us. Let's leave the prisoners in their darkness and return, slowly, to the faint light of the candle. Because in the next part, we'll drift back to palaces and crowns, where kings and queens weren't starving in dungeons, but were instead starving for heirs, and what happens when royal families get just a little too entangled with themselves. But that will be where we go next.